All right, so welcome to ModC, which is for businesses to learn a little bit about the business case for diversity. And we have Brittany and Jocelyn with us, and they might jump in and comment on some parts of this. But at the end of the video, we will have a forum if people want to contact us. If they're interested in doing a training at their organization, I have ethnography, so we can learn a little bit more about your organization if you want us to bring something like this to the place where you work or go in the community. So let's jump into it. We're going to start out just talking a little bit about the business case for diversity. And when you think about that, think of the ABCDs. So we're going to go over those. So A is advancement. And if you have an inclusive culture that allows for diversity, that business is going to evolve quicker and maybe adapt to new challenges that present themselves quicker by just being open to divergent thinkers. We talked about divergent thinking as being this process that guides evolution itself and helps solutions arise when you have multiple viewpoints and perspectives. So B stands for benefits. So if you are working with people with disabilities in the workplace, or they're on your board or on a panel, they're just going to have more people more social capital that they can involve in the decision making. People with disabilities also tend to maybe stay in a job longer and have extra support so they can continually adapt to the need of the business. There's also C, credit, the work opportunity tax credit, which is more of a monetary incentive to hire people with disabilities. But that's something you can talk to your accountant about, and over $1 billion are claimed each year in this tax credit. I'm curious how COVID's affected that, but this was before COVID. And then D, I have two meanings here, but diversity and disclosure. So I think we talked a lot about divergent thinking and why it's good to have diversity in the workplace. But through that diversity, you create more of this culture where it is open, where people are maybe more engaged in sharing things about themselves, and it's more of a positive experience being in that setting. A lot of people are caregivers, and they say the silver tide is coming with just the population aging, that more and more people are going to identify as caregivers. So recognizing that in the workplace through maybe flexible schedules or family leave, that's, I think, really important to the business case for diversity, because people are motivated, and if people are more relaxed, they can come up with more creative solutions than if they're stressed and worried about their job. Also, when you think about diversity, we talked about this term neurodiversity, and we watched a video at the end of Mod D, but they talked about, what grows together goes together, and that whole idea of biodiversity, how sometimes there is the remedy to something that's poisonous nearby. So having that idea that we are all connected through having a human experience, and if one of us has a challenge that presents itself, we can rely on some of the natural organic diversity in our environment to maybe remedy some of those issues through just involving more diverse people in the decision making. Disclosure also brings up the idea of that hidden self that we talked about in part 12 with the Johari window. And I would equate the hidden self, or this idea of, what is something that I withhold from other people that maybe I don't share right away, with a recruiting tactic that is more regio-centric. So maybe recruiting someone who you think is exactly what you're looking for, that's maybe a part of the culture that is going to maybe advance the business further. But some of those disadvantages to hiring someone that's maybe a part of the community or exactly what you're looking for, someone maybe like yourself, that there might be communication barriers that develop with the lack of international exposure or experience, and that could lead to some confusion between regional and global objectives. So if you are familiar with that term, I would kind of think that it relates with that idea of social capital, and having, if you hire someone that's like yourself and you have a similar theory of mind, recruiting someone in an ethnocentric way, someone that is more different from you, that has a different kind of cultural capital, that could be beneficial. So maybe hiring someone in a native country, if your organization is more global, that could be a good approach. But again, disadvantages to that could be culture clashes, living far away from the host country, and the failure rate is very high, with maybe not having a good open communication with the local manager, having different values or perspectives. But again, having that diversity could be important. But I think if we take on a polycentric recruiting approach to adding diversity to our organizations, this is more balancing that cultural and social capital, having someone who knows and understands diverse cultures, but maybe has more of the regional nuance and theory of mind. And the advantage to that approach is that it has the highest morale. But there could be some disadvantages with just different thinking processes and lack of knowledge about market conditions. But I think these are some important, harder conversations that are need to be had for people working in HR and recruiting, is how are we getting talent, and where are we getting talent from? And are we inclusive in our approach? And are we biased in thinking that we know the right person for this job? So I encourage people, if they're interested in this, line of thought to check out part 12, where we talk a little bit more about cultural capital and the hidden self. And I think it's important to this conversation of being more inclusive of diversity. So, but whatever you can to do, with Post-it notes, alarms, calendars, natural supports, including coworkers, there's so many different things you can try out to support that person's independence, but it's all about trying to make it where it's integrated and blends in with the culture of that workplace, and striving towards having the same standards for work too. So how are we going to make someone productive where their boss feels like they're contributing the same level as their other employees? So that might also call in to consider what their strengths and interests are, because people with autism sometimes have these untapped special talents or gifts that the average neurotypical person might not have. So that kind of ties us into our last piece of this, but it's this concept of neurodiversity. So we've talked about this before, but society moving away from the medical model of a disability into more of a social model, where we're not judging someone based on the fact that they have a disability, but more looking at that as just one part of their identity. So that perspective rejects the idea that there's something wrong with someone and something that needs to be cured. It's more looking at what is their unique neurological strengths, or what's special about, what are their contributions that can be translated into skills that are beneficial for a workplace. Like, we're kind of judgmental in regards to the past, how we've recruited people for the workplace. We have these, quizzes and applications that really only maybe look for one individual that can answer all those questions in a certain way. But we're maybe doing a disfavor to the organization by only recruiting a certain type of individual, because we are diverse. And the more we can match our populations, we're going to be more representative of our community, and I think maybe more ethical or moral in our approach to providing a community service if we are looking at diversity from not only how people can access our product, but how our products are created or our services are delivered. Because someone with autism might share that a new workspace is not accessible to them. So that disclosure alone is going to maybe have that culture of that organization change to be more inclusive. Just the fact that someone with a disability was hired there and they're speaking up about their personal experience with that. So we'll come back to neurodiversity later and some more tips and tools on what organizations can do to be more inclusive by maybe utilizing their union and adopting a neurodiversity policy. So there's lots of different things that can be done, but a neurodiversity policy, I think, is something that all organizations or businesses can consider. So I think that's a really powerful idea, a really important idea, this idea of neurodiversity. So any thoughts on that? idea or concept. Like I wrote down one idea earlier, but I talked about recruitment practices with those, how strongly do you agree or disagree with this statement? Those kind of maybe not being designed in a way where they are accepting of someone who's neurodiverse. So it's not just physical spaces, but it's the coded algorithms or technological online spaces that also can benefit from understanding neurodiversity and how that is important to the evolution of a business or an organization. But could this be interpreted differently, what we're talking about? I think I said before, it's important to be mindful of being overly compliant. It is that divergent thinking that is what drives evolution. And the first time I heard that or thought about that, I thought that was a really interesting thing. But it is those people who think differently, think outside the box, and that is what allows us to evolve and hopefully get more inclusive. But it is those people who are more of a divergent thinker. So I think if you are overly focused on compliance, you're not really allowing for that divergent thinking or for people to speak up and say, well, what about if we did it this way? So, but yeah, just thinking about this differently, like you could have more than one marginalized group that needs a different set of materials or maybe a different policy to address their unique needs in the workplace. Especially if there's a lot of social rules that are not being said or aren't explicit, that people just have to like pick up on the cues and understand how the culture works. Someone, if they're foreign or neurodiverse, I think having differentiated materials for those audiences could be helpful to advance inclusion too. That whole idea of a social versus a medical model, which we said dominates some of the political and legal decision making. I'd say like your medical model, that's sort of looking from a physical capital standpoint. Whereas maybe we want to move into that social model where we're seeing disability as a part of someone's culture. We talked about neurotypical speech, something that's accepted by the majority in contrast to a neurodiverse person. I would say that's social capital. If you're able to use or access that type of speech, you're using social capital. And then just talking about people with autism, people with intellectual disabilities, understanding that their executive functioning skills, their ability to adapt and make choices, that's going to be a separate spectrum from their disability. So I think executive functioning is somewhat important to understand, but that's more of a physical determinant driving the other capital that they can access. Just as like if someone's hyper or hyposensitive regarding stimulus from their environment, that again deals with like their physical environment, and I'd say physical capital. But if those people aren't accepted and they're discriminated against through bullying or exclusion, through the type of pay that they have, or even past experiences, like negative experiences that they had or trauma from other work sites. That I think that's cultural capital, right? Because it kind of deals with their past, but it might not be something that they see about themselves, but other people might see that they're a little bit shy or less assertive, maybe because they had a negative past experience that led them to a different view of themselves or having low self-confidence. So that idea of self-confidence, I think, is connected to that idea of social capital, because I think we become more confident in ourselves through disclosing certain things that are hidden. And if that is received well, that might increase our self-confidence. Or if we share something or embarrass ourselves, or we didn't pick up on a certain social rule, or people don't really understand the fact that you're a caregiver and you have certain responsibilities, like you asked for time off to help with a dependent that was diagnosed. I think that's social capital. Maybe a little bit of cultural capital too, which kind of mediates people being included or not. It's a little bit more subconscious, I think. But that self-confidence through disclosure or self-censorship, that is the hidden self, that's more social capital. So those are some of those barriers to inclusion. I think the discrimination, self-confidence. But now let's talk about like some of those tools, like the trade union representatives. So their role or objective is to be involved in protecting all workers and advance that anti-discrimination policy. So I'd say that is more of a moral capital realm. So their job does kind of operate in this more moral realm on how to make that happen in a more valid way, because we could get, like we said, reliable results based on taking a certain strategy, but that doesn't mean that however we're translating the situation, that is an effective way to advance inclusion. Because maybe you're just having more people that aren't speaking up because they're afraid they're going to be not compliant with their comments. So that could cause data to be reliable where you think people are being more inclusive, but in reality, it's not valid, and people are just more afraid to share or ask questions. I think the whole idea of reasonable accommodations or reasonable adjustments, like part-time or fixed hours, those kind of operate more in a moral capital space too. I think that word reasonable implies that we're not asking a whole lot. We're trying to have it be more of an equal playing field, and people are deserving of equal pay. Those are all like more moral kind of ideas, I would say. So I think employing some of this change modeling is important too, to support that business case for diversity through the culture, through promoting a change in thinking. So here are some tips from some research that I did when I was taking some courses in organizational leadership. But I think most people would agree that transparency is really important in the workplace. And by having a more open culture where leadership is communicating, that's going to foster that collaborative conflict culture, which helps with adaptation. So that's that divergent thinking and those voices and people speaking up. If there isn't transparency, people might be hiding things or hiding their true opinion about how to make something better, just based on how leadership engages with their employees. So valuing divergent thinkers. This is important because we can continually adapt our controls and our processes and our routines by having someone that says, well, what about doing it this way? If you don't have that open culture where people can speak up, things aren't going to adapt and change. The evolutionary change model, I'll just read this part, but it says once consensus is reached over the leadership program, an evolutionary approach to modeling the change can be aligned in an organization by permitting variations as deriving from managers' initiatives to compete for scarce resources. So what that's saying is in a competitive marketplace setting, whoever can adapt better to the challenge is going to be there longer in the long run. So that's why it's just on leadership to be more adaptable and modeling that behavior and encouraging people to speak up and share their vision of where they see the business going. All right, and then proof is in the innovation. So where some of my quotes came from, Van der Ven et al. Their research cites and explains that a greater number of diverse variations are more likely to produce innovations than a process that generates a small number of homogeneous variations. So that's saying if you recruit all the same people, you don't have a diverse organization, you're just going to get the same thing over and over again, and society isn't homogeneous. Maybe your clients more or less come from one location, a certain type of culture, but if we can be more diverse when we hire and recruit people, then we're more likely to adapt and innovate and come up with those solutions or variations on thinking that can lead a business to be more sustainable. We talked about this idea of an open space or an open culture by allowing opportunities where people can speak up and feel valued in what they have to say. That's going to instill confidence and also give some channels for HR to figure out who has leadership potential to advance and drive the thinking in this business. And it's important to note that when you are looking at change models, what precedes the change is always dissatisfaction with something. So that's a good way to get people on board, is what is bothering us, what's troubling us, and if we can get behind something and all get on the same page that something needs to change, that's going to drive that change more. But there's all different types of models for change. So something that's more dialectic, that involves communication, people speaking up. That's maybe more calm in the demeanor of the group versus something that's more of a conflictive change model where people can argue and maybe wear a different kind of thinking hat to speak their truth or however they see things happening. That's another thing. The 6 thinking hats is another approach to working with groups, so people are on the same page when they're brainstorming on how to solve a certain problem. The article also talked about all of the decision making involving people with disabilities. I kind of call this a voice mandate. Both of you being involved in this program, I think, is important because you both self-identify with a disability, and I think that is this idea of this voice mandate, which I think is a moral idea that, well, of course, people with disabilities should be involved in that decision making. So I think that is a good example of moral capital. Okay, I've got 2 more terms. Okay. I didn't know if you were going to say something there.
Yeah, I was. So, being in this program is very helpful for me because, I worked since I was 16, and I've seen the good and the bad of working, and it helps me to, try to inform people with disabilities, also to, say how you feel. Don't shut down just because if they don't understand you, there's somebody that will understand you. And it's like if you have a caregiver or your family, if you're close with your friend, you can always talk to them and they can help you, talk you through helping you with your job, and then your job coach. And it's very important, I believe it is very important for people that have a disability to have a job coach, because then they can be your voice, a voice and everything. So it's just the idea of, being in the work field, you want to make your extra money because you have bills, and disability can only give you so much.
Right.
And so it's just, I think everybody that has a disability, can be mental, physical, intellectual, whatever, it's needed. And it doesn't matter with the age.
Right.
So that's what I strongly believe that.
Yeah, and I think you, Jocelyn, you're like a peer advocate, maybe in some ways. Maybe you see yourself as a mentor in some ways. But I think all of that is really important, to have people who are like me, that sort of understand what maybe I went through or I'm going through, and to give me that advice. So mentoring too can be done more inclusively if you allow for more choice making to happen, by being able to maybe pick someone who you identify with more if you are being given a mentor. So you can find someone who has or understands that cultural capital that maybe you bring to the table, because maybe your culture or your being is sort of similar and you can relate more to that person. So
I was going to say, I never thought of myself as being someone's mentor. I feel like I'm not, maybe it's because I'm like self-conscious too, is I don't feel that. I just know by experience, and I can just give advice, but mentoring, I would make a good mentor. I'm still learning myself.
Yeah. Well, life's like, it's a never-ending process of learning, but I would say you would make a good mentor because you're a thinker. Like you said to me one of the first days we met, you have a lot of good ideas, and sometimes being a teacher or being a mentor isn't giving someone the idea, but you're saying something that makes them think about their problem in a different way. And it's like pulling the answer outside, pulling the answer that's within them. And I think you can do that just through being there to listen and really understand maybe what the person's going through. So it's cool.
I was going to say something.
Yeah.
I believe like this has been like necessary not being a mentor, but it's like if you have somebody that's willing to help and you learn as you go,
Yeah.
like for me, sometimes when you and I talk about certain things, Jocelyn, I mean, I see you as a sister, not a friend, but like you have helped me like several times. That's not necessarily being a mentor, but that's just like being somebody that cares, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, if we can self-select a mentor or a friend or advocate, based on whatever our goals are, that's going to help us the most, because maybe you want someone who understands you from a cultural perspective more, and that's going to help you with feeling better about yourself or more confident in a job or elsewhere in the community. But maybe you just have a question about how to use YouTube most effectively. And so maybe you need someone who's more of a specialist. And so being able to lead with your goals and who you are and pick those people to help you, especially if you're looking at like a specialist, I would say that's accessing that social capital more. It's like finding someone who is the expert, really developed in that theory of mind on how to use YouTube and get the most viewers. That's more of a social capital idea. So I think mentoring, that idea of multi-level mentoring that's more self-selected, can benefit from this idea of looking at social versus cultural capital, and moral capital being what maybe bridges both of those together. Here is just our last slide with some contact information, my email, phone number, and website with some information on self-determination if people are interested in checking that out. But some of our other videos are going to be going up on our YouTube channel. My email is on our website as well, or you could reach out to me on LinkedIn. And so thank you for watching. And I think we are going to end, unless Brittany, Jocelyn, you have any final thoughts or ideas. I know this was pretty advanced business thought, kind of like master's level research. But
I'll let Brittany go first.
if you have something, but I think that idea of divergent thinking is important. That makes sense. Like people who think different, who don't think like everyone else.
Yeah, and it's important to get people with disabilities a job, and some of them want to work and some of them just have like a like a intellectual disability, guess like dyslexia or ADD or something, and then have a physical disability and having cerebral palsy or having a all kinds of different types of disabilities. But there's some people I know that can't work because of their health. It's with their disability along with their health issues, but try to consider them anyway. They can probably just do maybe say one day a week or something, and it's like for a couple hours, and it's just something for them to be something to do, stabilizing their mind and stuff, not focusing on their their health and stuff, because that can be depressing itself. And it's important to not to judge anybody that has a disability. Because when we go for an interview, then you want to just try. They might not have the best they're not probably more verbal and don't say the proper words that you expect. But it's just you have to consider people working with disabilities as well, because we're also human beings just like you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, everyone's different. And I think you kind of made me think of that intersectionality idea of just because someone has cerebral palsy doesn't make you assume something about them, because they could have other valuable traits to their personality to add to the organization, to their whole thinking process. But the more people you can involve from ranks of the organization to participate in crafting that change to the culture to be more inclusive, the more people you have of different backgrounds and experiences, all of that's going to allow for that interaction where people can socially construct that new envisioned state of where the culture should be or how we should recruit and make this a sustainable model. So I think diversity is really important to having a culture that is going to evolve and be sustainable in the future, but also balancing that with how are people feeling in the present state and how things are, and what sort of brand strategy or philosophy can we employ to get people to feel like they are valued, so people want to speak up and be a part and have a voice in that change. So some interesting stuff to think about, but hopefully that was helpful for some people who made it to the end of this video. So thanks again for watching, and reach out with any questions or send me an email. Thanks. Bye.